On a dead world at the edge of the known galaxy, there is a valley where the dust never quite settles. The wind moves through it in long, dry breaths, carrying red sand against the faces of statues that were old before most of the galaxy's languages were ever spoken. The statues are enormous. They show robed figures with heavy brows and cruel mouths, their hands resting on the pommels of swords, their eyes carved hollow so that the desert shows through them. Below those faces, cut into the cliffs, are doors, and behind the doors are tombs. This place has many names across many ages, but the one that lasted is Korriban. Later it would be called Moribund, when even the people who feared it had begun to forget why. It is a graveyard now. It has been a graveyard for so long that the word barely fits anymore. But it did not begin as a graveyard. Long before the first tomb was sealed, before the first Dark Lord was laid to rest in the cliffs, this world was alive. It had cities, it had kings, it had a people who walked its valleys with red skin and golden eyes, who built temples to powers they did not fully understand, and who gave themselves a name that would one day be stolen, twisted, and carried across 10,000 years of galactic history until almost no one remembered where it came from. That name was Sith. When most people in the galaxy hear that word, they picture a hooded figure with a red blade. They picture lightning leaping from outstretched fingers, an old man on a throne, a masked apprentice breathing through a ruined chest. They picture the dark side of the Force given a face and a title. And they would not be wrong, exactly. But they would be looking at the very end of a very long story and mistaking it for the beginning. Because before the Sith were an order, before they were a religion of power and a chain of masters and apprentices stretching down the centuries, the Sith were a species, a living people, born on one world, with their own bodies and their own bloodlines and their own gods. The Dark Lords, who would one day terrify the galaxy, did not invent that name. They took it. They wore it the way a conqueror wears a crown that belonged to the king he killed. This is the story of the people who owned that name first. It is one of the oldest stories there is. To tell it properly, we have to go back further than the Republic, further than the Jedi as anyone would recognize them, back past wars whose names survive only as inscriptions on broken stone. We have to go back to a time when the galaxy was younger and stranger, when ancient powers still walked openly, and the line between flesh and the Force had not yet hardened into the thing it later became. And we have to go to two worlds in particular, both of them now silent, both of them remembered mostly as places of death. Korriban, the tomb world, and Ziost, the cold throne in the dark. Settle in, because this is going to be a long road, and the further back we go, the stranger the ground becomes. If the slow telling of old, forgotten histories is the kind of thing that helps your mind unwind before sleep, the most useful thing you can do is subscribe and switch on notifications so the next of these long journeys finds you when it is ready. That is the only thing I will ask of you for a good while. After this, it is just you, the Dark, and the oldest dynasty in the galaxy. Now, where do we even start with a people this old? The honest answer is that no one fully knows. That is not a dodge. It is the central fact about the Sith species, and it shapes everything that comes after. By the time anyone in the wider galaxy bothered to write down what the Sith were, the species had already been changed almost beyond recognition. Their history had been rewritten by the very people who conquered them. Their oldest records were carved by priests who had every reason to lie. What survives is a layering of myth on top of myth. Holocron recordings made by liars, inscriptions made by tyrants, and the scattered memories of a culture that worshipped power and despised weakness, which is a culture with very little interest in telling the truth about itself. So when we walk through the deep past of this people, we are walking through fog. Some of what we find is solid, Some of it is the kind of story the Sith told about themselves to make themselves feel eternal. Part of the work of this entire video is learning to tell those two things apart. Start with the body, because the body is the one thing that does not lie. A pure-blooded member of the Sith species was an unmistakable sight. The skin ranged across deep reds, from a dull brick shade to a furious crimson, and in some individuals it darkened toward a heavy, bruised purple or a near black that seemed to drink the light. The eyes were yellow or orange, and in the oldest and most powerful, they were said to burn. The face was its own kind of map. Many Sith bore a pair of tendrils hanging from the cheeks or chin, thick fleshy growths sometimes called chun and chin, which they grew long and ornamented as a mark of standing. Above the brow and along the jaw, bony spurs pushed through the skin in some lineages, giving the head a crowned, armored look. The brow itself was heavy and ridged. The teeth were sharp. There was nothing soft about the design. Even at rest, a member of the Sith species looked like something built for dominance, and they knew it, and they made sure everyone else knew it too. That appearance was not an accident of fashion. It was the result of an environment that punished weakness without mercy for longer than most species have existed. To understand the people, you have to understand the worlds that made them. And the first of those worlds is Korriban. Korriban sits far out in the galaxy's southern reaches, in a region so remote that for most of recorded history, the major powers of the galaxy did not know it existed and would not have cared if they did. It is a small, rocky planet wrapped in a thin, dry atmosphere. Its surface is desert, broken by mountain ranges and deep canyon valleys that the wind has been carving for longer than there has been anyone to watch. The days are harsh and the nights are bitter. Water is rare and precious. There is very little here to support life as the rest of the galaxy understands it. And yet life took hold, because Korriban has something most worlds do not. It is soaked in the dark side of the Force. This is the part that is genuinely difficult to explain, and it is the part that matters most. On Korriban, the dark side is not a philosophy or a temptation or a choice a person makes. It is a feature of the planet itself, like the gravity or the thin air. Something happened there in the unimaginably distant past. Some concentration of death and suffering and raw power that stained the world at a level deeper than soil. The valleys hum with it. The stone remembers it. Beings sensitive to the Force who set foot on Korriban have described the same thing across thousands of years and many different cultures, a pressure that settles over the mind, a whispering at the edge of hearing, a feeling of being watched by something vast and patient and hungry. The planet does not merely permit dark power, it invites it, it rewards it. And a species that evolved in that pressure, generation after generation, was always going to come out of it shaped in a particular way. The Sith species came out of it shaped for the dark side, the way deep-sea creatures come out of the pressure, shaped for the deep. They did not learn the dark side. They were born into it. Force sensitivity was not the rare gift among them that it was among other peoples. It ran through the population the way physical strength or sharp eyesight runs through other species, common, expected, woven into the bloodline. Not every Sith was a sorcerer, but the capacity was always there, sleeping in the blood, waiting for the right pressure to wake it. And because the planet itself fed that capacity, the Sith grew up in a world where unseen power was simply part of daily life. A world where the strong could reach out and bend the weak without lifting a hand. A world where the dead did not always stay quiet. A species that grows its entire culture under those conditions ends up standing every other people's assumptions on their head. Every belief that other peoples hold about fairness, about restraint, about the value of the weak gets turned inside out. On most worlds, cooperation is the survival strategy. The group that shares survives the winter. The group that protects its weakest members keeps its numbers up. But on Korriban, the dark side rewarded the opposite instinct. It poured strength into the dominant and let it flow away from the submissive. It made cruelty efficient. A culture growing in that soil does not arrive at kindness as a virtue. It arrives at power as the only virtue, and everything else, every loyalty and every law and every god, gets bent into the service of that one truth. And the Sith did build gods. That is one of the first things their oldest records make clear. This was not a species that stumbled toward religion slowly over thousands of years of doubt. The Sith were certain. They looked at the power running through their world and through their own blood, and they did not call it the Force, because that word and that idea belonged to other peoples far away. They called it by their own names, and they built a faith around it that was as old as their civilization and as merciless as their planet. At the center of that faith stood the figures whose statues still loom over the valley today. The kings, the sorcerer-lords, the ones strong enough in the dark to rule the rest. We will get deep into how that society was organized, because it is one of the most fascinating and disturbing structures in galactic history. The Sith did not have classes the way other peoples did, divided by wealth or trade. They had castes, and the castes were divided by exactly one thing, which was your relationship to power. At the bottom were the laborers and the warriors, bred and shaped for strength and obedience. Above them were the engineers and the builders, who kept the cities standing and the war machines running. And above all of them, untouchable, stood the priest caste, the sorcerers, the ones who could touch the dark side directly and command it. That structure was not designed for comfort or for fairness. It was designed to take a planet's worth of dark side talent and concentrate it, generation after generation, into the hands of the few who could wield the most of it. It worked terrifyingly well. We will spend real time inside it. But before any of that, before the castes and the kings and the wars, there is the deepest layer of the story, and it is the strangest. Because the Sith species, for all its power, may not have been entirely the author of its own beginning. Here is where the fog gets thickest, and here is where I have to be honest with you about what is solid and what is shadow. The records that survive about the earliest age of Korriban are not Sith records at all in the form we have them. They were copied, recopied, and edited across thousands of years by later rulers who wanted the past to flatter the present. What those records describe is a time before the Sith civilization rose, when the world was inhabited by the species in a more scattered, more primitive state, and when something came to them, something arrived on Korriban, or was already there, that lifted them out of the dust and taught them what they were capable of. The records do not agree on what it was. Some speak of a being or beings of immense power who ruled the early Sith as living gods. Some speak of knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, the sudden appearance of sorcery and architecture and statecraft far beyond what the species had managed on its own. And tangled up in all of it is the figure who casts the longest shadow over the entire history we are about to walk through. A king, the first true king, the one the later Sith would name as the greatest of them all, and would spend 10,000 years trying and failing to equal. They called him the Sith'ari, the perfect being, the one who would lead the Sith and free the Sith and destroy the Sith and raise them more powerful than ever. It was a prophecy and a title and an obsession all at once. And it ran through Sith culture like a crack through stone, splitting open again and again across the centuries whenever a new lord rose powerful enough to make people whisper that maybe, this time, the prophecy had come true. We will trace that idea all the way down through the ages, because it explains things about the Sith that nothing else does. It explains why they could never simply rule in peace. It explains the endless betrayals, the masters murdered by apprentices, the empires that rose only to tear themselves apart from the inside. A people who believe their perfection lies in their own destruction will eventually destroy themselves. The Sith did more than once, but that is far down the road. For now, hold on to the shape of the mystery. A red-skinned people born on a world soaked in death, sensitive to the dark side in their very blood, organized into castes built to harvest power, ruled by sorcerer-kings, and haunted from their earliest days by the idea of a perfect being who would lead them to glory and ruin in the same breath. That is the species. That is the thing the later Dark Lords would find, conquer, and rename. And the moment those Dark Lords arrived is the hinge on which this whole history turns. The day the word Sith stopped meaning a people and started meaning a power. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, and why it was such a catastrophe for the species that owned the name first, we have to understand what the Sith had already become on their own, in their long isolation, before anyone from the outside galaxy ever set foot in the Red Valleys. Because here is the thing the later legends always got backward. The Dark Lords did not bring the dark side to the Sith. The Sith had been swimming in it since before the first of those Lords was born. What the Lords brought was something else. They brought the outside. They brought knowledge of a wider galaxy, of lightsabers and starships, and a war fought light years away over questions the Sith had never thought to ask. They brought a kind of sophistication the Sith lacked. And in exchange, the Sith gave them something the outsiders had never imagined possible. A whole world and a whole bloodline already perfectly tuned to the very power those outsiders had been exiled for using. It was a meeting of two halves of the same darkness. And like most such meetings in Sith history, it began with worship and ended with chains. We are going to walk through every step of it. We are going to stand in the deep past of Korriban and watch a primitive people become an empire. We are going to meet the god kings whose names survive on broken statues, the priests who carved their lies into temple walls, and the one king above all the others whose memory bent the whole future of the species around itself. We are going to watch the outsiders arrive. And we are going to watch what they did to the people they found. And we are going to follow the long, slow, terrible decline of a species that gave its name to the galaxy's greatest evil, and then was nearly erased by it. By the end, when we stand again in that valley where the dust never settles, you will understand exactly whose tombs those are, and why the planet was renamed for the dead, and what it really means that the most feared word in the galaxy was, once, simply what a living people called themselves. Let me set the scene properly, because the geography of this is going to matter more than you would expect. The Sith species did not, in the end, live on only one world. Korriban was the cradle, the holy place, the world where the dead kings were buried, and where the dark side ran strongest. But it was a hard world, even for the Sith. And as their civilization grew, it reached outward to a second world that became, in many ways, the true seat of their living power. That world was Ziost. Ziost lay in the same remote region of space, close enough to Korriban to be reached but far enough to be its own place. Where Korriban was desert and stone and relentless heat, Ziost was cold, brutally cold. Long winters locked the world in ice and dark for the greater part of its year, and the brief, warm seasons were short and grudging. It was not a gentler world than Korriban. It was simply cruel in a different direction. And it was on Ziost, more than on Korriban, that the Sith built the heart of their kingdom, the seat of their kings, the center of their government, such as it was. Korriban became the sacred ground, the burial world, the place you went to be entombed if you were great enough to deserve it. Ziost became the place you went to rule, Two worlds, then, one for the living power and one for the dead, bound together into a single civilization that called itself by a single name. And that name, again and always, was Sith. The space between and around those two worlds filled with others over time. Colonies, outposts, lesser worlds brought under the king's control. The Sith were not content to sit on their two homeworlds once their power had grown, and the region of space they came to dominate became known, much later, by the simple and ominous label of the Sith Worlds, a cluster of planets in the deep galactic south that the rest of the galaxy did not know and would not have wanted to know. Within that cluster, the Sith built something that genuinely deserves the word empire, an empire that rose and stood and ruled for an enormously long span of time, entirely cut off from the rest of galactic civilization, developing along its own dark lines, answering to no one, ruled by sorcerer-kings whose word was law, and whose power was, to their subjects, indistinguishable from the power of gods. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. While the rest of the galaxy was busy with its own histories, while distant peoples rose and fell, and the great institutions that would one day define galactic life took their first shaky forms, there was this other thing out in the dark, an entire empire of dark side users. A whole society, millions strong across many worlds, in which the dark side was not the forbidden secret of a few sorcerers, but the open organizing principle of the entire civilization. Nothing else like it would ever exist again. Later, there would be dark orders and dark academies and dark masters with their apprentices, small and hidden and hunted. But there would never again be a whole living people, a whole species and the worlds it ruled, built openly and totally around the dark side of the Force. The Sith species was the only time it ever happened, and it happened out at the edge of everything, in the cold and the dust, for so long that by the time the galaxy learned of it, it was already on its way to being a memory. That is the scale of what we are dealing with. Not a villain, not an order, a people, a faith, and an empire, the oldest of its kind, the source of the most enduring name in the history of the dark side. Everything that comes later in the galaxy's long war between the light and the dark, every Sith Lord who ever drew a red blade, every empire that ever rose in the name of order through fear, traces its lineage back through that name to this. To the red valleys of Korriban and the cold throne of Ziost, and a species that the rest of the galaxy nearly forgot. Ziost was the other half of the answer. If Korriban was the holy ground, Ziost was the seat of power. And where Korriban burned, Ziost froze. It lay close enough to be reached by the early Sith, and far enough to be its own kingdom. A world locked in long, brutal winters with brief, grudging summers between them. The cold of Ziost was not the clean cold of high mountains. It was a grinding, patient cold that killed the careless and rewarded those who could plan, hoard, and dominate the resources that meant survival. On Ziost, the Sith built their cities of black stone, raised their first true thrones, and learned the arts of rule. It became the capital in everything but name long before there was a name for what they were building. The dead went to Korriban to be entombed in the cliffs. The living ruled from Ziost. And between the two, across the worlds that lay near them, the Sith spread out into the dark stretch of space that would one day be marked on 100 charts as a region to avoid. So that is the cradle. A burning tomb world and a freezing throne world, both saturated with the dark side, both unforgiving, both shaping a single species across a span of time so long that the species could not remember a beginning. The question that follows is the one that everything else hangs on. What kind of people grows up in a place like that? And how do you organize a society when raw, unseen power runs unevenly through your bloodline like a vein of ore through rock? The Sith answer to that question was the caste. Other peoples across the galaxy divided themselves in the ordinary ways, by wealth, by trade, by birth into this family or that. The Sith did none of that, or rather they did all of it and then buried it under the one division that actually mattered to them. They sorted themselves by their grip on the dark side. A Sith was not high or low because of what their parents owned. They were high or low because of what the Force had given them and what they had the will to seize. And over thousands of years, that single principle hardened into a rigid order of castes, each one bred and shaped for its place, each one knowing exactly how far above or below it stood in relation to every other. At the foundation, holding up everything else, were the laboring castes. The Grothu were among them. Drones in the truest sense, bred across generations for endurance and obedience and very little else, set to the endless work of quarrying the black stone, hauling, digging, dying, and being replaced. They were the muscle of the civilization at its crudest. They had no voice and no future beyond the task in front of them. And the higher castes spent no more thought on them than a builder spends on the individual stones in a wall. It is an ugly thing to describe, and it was an ugly thing to be. And the Sith felt no shame about it at all, because shame was a weakness, and the Sith had filed every weakness out of themselves like a smith filing burrs off a blade. Above the drones stood the makers. The Zuguruk were the engineers and the smiths, the caste that kept the war machines running and the great works standing. They worked metal and stone and stranger materials besides, and the best of them touched the edges of the dark arts that the priests guarded, because true Sith craft was never only a matter of hammer and forge. A Sith blade was not merely sharpened, it was bound, worked through with dark side energy until it could turn a lightsaber and drink the power of the one who wielded it. The vaults and tombs of Korriban did not merely have doors. They had wards, traps woven half of stone and half of spirit, set to wake and kill long after their makers were dust. That craft lived in the maker caste, and it made them valuable. And value bought them a place above the drones and below the warriors, where they stayed. The warriors were the Massassi, and the Massassi are the part of this story that echoes longest into the future. They were bred for one purpose, and the breeding was relentless. Tall, powerful, savage in close combat, their bodies pushed by generations of selection and by darker arts besides toward a single ideal of physical menace. The Massassi were the spear of the Sith, the caste sent to conquer and to die conquering, and they were shaped to want nothing else. Loyalty was bred into them as far down as muscle. A Massassi warrior would throw himself onto the blades of an enemy at a word from his lord and count it an honor, and that absolute engineered devotion made them the most fearsome shock troops the old Sith ever fielded. Hold the Massassi in your mind, because long after the pure Sith species had faded, one Dark Lord in his exile would take the surviving Massassi and twist them with Sith alchemy into something even worse, and they would build temples in his name on a jungle moon that the galaxy would remember with a shudder. But that is later. For now they are simply the warriors, the third rung, the strength of the kingdom. Above the warriors, the makers and the drones, set apart from all of them by the only thing the Sith truly respected, stood the priests. The Kissai were the sorcerer caste, the keepers of the faith and the wielders of the dark side in its refined and studied forms, where a warrior felt the dark side as fury and a maker felt it as craft. The Kissai understood it as a discipline, a body of knowledge handed down and added to across the ages, written in a language built for the purpose and guarded jealously from anyone not born to read it. They tended the temples, they performed the rites, they spoke to the powers the Sith worshipped, And in the eyes of the lower castes, they did not merely serve the gods, they came close to being gods themselves. From the ranks of the Kissai rose the figures who actually ruled, the sorcerer-lords and the kings, the ones whose command of the dark side outstripped everyone around them so completely that no one could question it and live. To see how all of this came to be, you have to go back further still, past the first cities and the first temples, to the age before the Sith had any of it, when they were not yet a civilization at all but a scattering of clans clinging to a pair of murderous worlds. There are no records from that age. There could not be, because writing came later, and the people who lived it left nothing but the deep grooves their existence wore into the culture that followed. What can be said about it has to be read backward, out of what the Sith became, the way you read the shape of a riverbed from the canyon it carved. And what the canyon says is that the dark side was there from the very start, working on the species before the species had any idea it was being worked on. Picture the earliest Sith then, long before kings and castes, as small bands scattered across the red wastes of Korriban and the frozen reaches of Ziost, surviving the way anything survives on worlds that hard, by being tougher and more ruthless than the things trying to kill them. But these bands had something other primitive peoples did not. The dark side ran in their blood, common rather than rare. And on a world soaked in dark side power, that gift did not stay quiet. In every band there were individuals in whom the power ran strongest, and on Korriban strength of that kind announces itself early and cannot be hidden. A child who could make the older and larger fear him without lifting a hand did not stay a follower for long. The strongest in the dark side rose to lead, not by election or inheritance, but by the plain fact that no one could stand against them, and the earliest Sith leaders were therefore sorcerers before they were ever kings, beings who ruled because the dark side had marked them as the ones who could take what they wanted and keep it. That is the seed from which everything else grew. A people in whom power was unevenly distributed, on a world that fed power, will sort itself into the strong and the rest, and the strong will rule, and over enough generations that sorting hardens into law. The caste system did not arrive one day by decree. It grew slowly out of 10,000 small surrenders, the weak submitting to the strong because submission was survival, and the dark side punished any other choice. The sorcerer leaders gathered followers, then warriors, then laborers to do the work that warriors would not, and the rough shape of the castes was already there in the earliest bands, long before anyone gave the layers names. By the time the Sith were building their first cities, the order of things was fixed, and it was the same order that would govern them for the rest of their existence. The powerful on top, holding the dark side and the knowledge of it, everyone else below, sorted by how useful they were to the powerful, all the way down to the bred drones who were barely considered people at all. And as the strong rose, they reached for something to explain and to bless their rising, and they found it in the only place a Sith would ever look, which was in power itself. The early Sith did not worship gods of mercy or harvest or love, because their world contained no evidence that such things existed or mattered. They worshipped what they could see working on them every day, the devouring power that ran through their planet and their blood, the force that lifted the strong and ground down the weak, and asked for nothing but more of both. They gave that power names in their own harsh tongue, and they told stories about it, and the stories all came down to the same hard truth. The universe was a hunger. Existence was the strong feeding on the weak. To be holy was to feed and to grow, and to be damned was to be fed upon, and there was no third option and no appeal. Some of their oldest tales spoke of dark powers or dark gods who embodied that hunger, beings of pure dominion and appetite, to whom the Sith owed their strength and their nature, and whether those powers were ever anything more than the species' own reflection of the dark side staring back at it. The Sith believed in them completely and shaped their rites and their sacrifices around them. It was a faith with no comfort in it anywhere, and that was the point. A religion that promised the weak their reward in some later life would have undermined the whole order the Sith were building, because it would have given the trodden upon a reason to endure their place instead of a reason to claw their way out of it or die. The Sith faith offered the weak nothing and told them plainly that they deserved nothing, that their weakness was their judgment and their suffering was the natural and correct order of things. And it offered the strong everything, told them their power was holy and their dominion was destiny, and their cruelty was the will of the very forces that made the world. A faith like that is a perfect engine for producing tyrants, because it removes every brake that other cultures put on their most ambitious members. There was no Sith virtue of restraint to be praised, no Sith story of a mighty ruler brought low by pride, no warning anywhere in the whole tradition that power might be a thing to be wary of. Power was simply good, and more power was simply better, and the only sin a Sith could commit was to be weaker than he might have been. This is the world that needed an Addus, the world he was born into and the world he briefly silenced. For a long stretch of their early history, though, the Sith had no single ruler over all of this. The picture of a unified Sith kingdom comes later. In the deepest age, the species was scattered across its worlds in rival domains, tribe against tribe, sorcerer-lord against sorcerer-lord, each holding what they could take and losing it again to someone stronger. The same principle that organized a single Sith household, strength rules and the weak serve, organized the whole species into a churning competition with no peace in it. Lords rose and fell, bloodlines climbed to dominance and were pulled down. The dark side rewarded ambition, and ambition tore the Sith apart again and again, so that for age after age there was no Sith nation, only Sith warlords drowning each other in the dust. It took something extraordinary to break that pattern, even for a while. It took a king unlike any the species had produced before, one strong enough to make all the other lords kneel, and the Sith remembered him so completely and for so long that his name became tangled with their oldest prophecy and their deepest idea of what perfection might look like. He is where we go next, because to understand the Sith species at its height, you have to understand the one figure who, for 300 years, made the whole quarreling, murderous people into something that could be called an empire. The Sith called him their first true king. The records call him Addus, and the story of how he rose, how he ruled, and how he died, fighting an enemy that came down out of the sky pretending to be gods, is one of the strangest and most important episodes in the entire history we are tracing. Addus was born into a world of warring lords, and almost nothing certain survives about his early life, which is fitting for a figure who became more legend than man. What the Sith remembered, and what they carved and recopied across the ages, was that he was different from the moment his power showed. His skin was not the red of his people. It was black, a deep obsidian sheen that marked him out as something rare, perhaps something touched, and in a culture that read power into the body itself. That strangeness was taken as a sign. Whether it truly meant anything, or whether the later Sith simply needed their founder king to be visibly set apart, the result was the same. Addus carried the mark of the exceptional, and he had the strength to back the mark up. He rose the way every Sith Lord rose, by defeating those around him. But he did not stop where other lords stopped. The ordinary pattern was for a strong lord to carve out a domain, hold it against rivals, and eventually be pulled down by an even stronger one before he could unite very much. Adus broke the pattern by being so far beyond his rivals that the pulling down never came. One by one, the warring sorcerer lords of the Sith were conquered, killed, or made to kneel. And for the first time in the memory of the species, the whole quarreling people answered to a single throne. He took or was given a title that the Sith would never forget. They called him Sith'ari, which in their tongue meant something close to Overlord, Lord above all lords, the one at the top of every chain. In his own age, it was a description of fact. He ruled and everyone else obeyed. Only later, long after his death, would the word swell into a prophecy and a religion of its own. In Adus's own time, it simply meant the king, and he was, by every account that survives, a remarkable king. He ruled for around 3 centuries, an enormous span even for a species as long-lived as the Sith, and under him the civilization reached a height it had never known. The warring stopped, or at least turned outward instead of inward. The castes settled into their work. The cities grew. The dark arts of the Kissai were gathered and refined under a single authority, instead of being hoarded by 100 feuding lords. For 300 years, the Sith were not a swarm of murderers tearing at each other, but a kingdom, ordered and powerful, and ruled by a being whose command of the dark side none of them could approach. If the Sith species had a golden age, this was it, though golden is a strange word for a people whose order rested on bred slaves and engineered warriors, and a faith that called mercy a sickness. It was their height. Whether height and golden are the same thing is a question the Sith never thought to ask. Adus's 3 centuries on the throne are worth seeing clearly, because they are the thing the Sith would spend the next 10,000 years trying and failing to get back. Under Adus, the endless churn of lord against lord did not merely pause, it was redirected. The ambition that had always turned inward, every sorcerer lord clawing at the one above him, was turned outward instead, toward the consolidation of the worlds and the gathering of the species into a single instrument. The lesser kings who had spent their lives feuding now answered to a throne strong enough that feuding was suicide, and with their energies no longer spent tearing at each other, they could be spent building. The cities grew larger and grander than they ever had. The roads of trade and tribute between Korriban and Ziost and the lesser worlds ran without the constant raiding that had strangled them before. The Maker caste could undertake works that took longer than a single warlord's lifetime to complete, because for the first time there was a continuity of rule that would outlast any one builder. A unified Sith people, even a unified Sith people as cruel as this one, could accomplish things that 100 feuding Sith warlords never could. And for 3 centuries, the species got a taste of what its enormous power could do when it was not being spent on murdering itself. They found Korriban. And they made a mistake. The records, foggy as ever, describe the arrival as a deception. The visitors did not come announcing conquest. They came wearing the appearance of something higher, presenting themselves to the Sith as powers worthy of worship, offering knowledge and trade, and the kind of awe that a technologically superior people can manufacture in front of a less advanced one. To a species raised to read strength as holiness, beings who could cross the stars and command machines beyond Sith understanding might well look like gods, and the visitors counted on exactly that. The plan was the plan that had worked on world after world. Be worshipped, then be obeyed, then own everything and everyone. It was a good plan against most peoples, against the Sith, ruled by a king who had spent 3 centuries seeing through the schemes of everyone who had ever tried to flatter him into submission. It failed. Adus was not fooled. Whether by the cold logic of a ruler who trusted no one, or by some deeper sense of the dark side recognizing the calculation behind the visitors' show of divinity, the Sith'ari saw the offered worship for what it was, the opening move of an enslavement. And he did the one thing the conquerors never expected from a people they had marked as future slaves. He refused, and then he fought. The Sith did not bow to the visitors from the sky. They turned on them. What followed was a war between two ancient powers, the star-crossing empire with its machines and its hyperdrive and its endless reserves, against a single world of dark side sorcerers and bred warriors who knew their own ground and feared nothing. It was, by the standards of the Sith, a catastrophe and a triumph at the same time. The fighting was terrible. The visitors had advantages the Sith had never faced: ships and weapons and the simple ability to come and go between the stars while the Sith were rooted to their worlds. But the Sith had Korriban itself fighting for them, the dark side pressing on the invaders. And they had Adas, and they had a willingness to spend Massassi lives without limit that few enemies could match. Slowly, bloodily, the Sith broke the invasion. They denied the conquerors the easy slaves they had come for. They turned the world into a graveyard for the would-be gods. And in the doing, the Sith took something from their enemies that would change them forever. Because in fighting a star-crossing empire, you cannot help but learn that the stars can be crossed. The Sith captured ships, they captured knowledge. They learned from the very beings who had come to enslave them the secret that they too could one day leave their worlds and reach out into the dark between the stars. The cage had a door, and the jailers had shown them where it was. But the price was the king. Adas fell in that war. The accounts differ on exactly how, as they differ on everything about him. But they agree that the Sith'ari, the overlord who had united the species and ruled it for 3 centuries and seen through the lie of the false gods, died fighting them. The greatest king the Sith ever produced was gone, and he left no one capable of holding what he had built. The unity that had rested entirely on his unmatched strength died with him. The kingdom of Adas did not pass smoothly to an heir, because in a culture where strength alone justifies rule, an heir who is merely strong cannot hold what a legend held. Within a span that the Sith would later mourn, the great unified kingdom of Adas fractured. The old pattern came roaring back. Lord turned on Lord. Domain split from domain, and the Sith species fell once more into the long churning warfare that had defined it before the king rose. The golden age, such as it was over almost as soon as it had been won. What did not die was the memory. If anything, death made Adas larger. A living king is a rival to be resented and undermined. A dead king 3 centuries great becomes a god to be longed for. And that is exactly what happened to the memory of Adas among the Sith. The title he had worn, Sith'ari, did not fade with his kingdom. It deepened. It grew roots. Across the fractured ages that followed, the idea took hold that Adas had been more than a king, that he had been the prophesied perfect being, and that another like him would come again. The prophecy of the Sith'ari, as it crystallized over the long centuries, promised that a perfect being would rise among the Sith, that this being would break the Sith and remake them, would tear down the old order and lift the species higher than it had ever stood, freeing them from their chains and their weaknesses in the very act of destroying what they had been. Sit with how strange and how dangerous that idea is, because it is the key to almost everything the Sith ever did afterward. A prophecy of a savior is common enough across the galaxy's peoples. A prophecy of a savior whose salvation is indistinguishable from destruction is something rarer and far more corrosive. The Sith'ari was promised to destroy the Sith and to make them stronger, both at once, as if ruin and glory were the same act seen from 2 sides. A people who believe that the highest fulfillment of their destiny looks like their own annihilation will, given enough time, arrange that annihilation for themselves. They will tear down everything they build, betray every order they establish, murder their own greatest figures in the conviction that the destroyer might be the savior in disguise. The Sith'ari prophecy did not predict the self-destruction of the Sith. It licensed it. It made the endless betrayals and collapses that fill Sith history feel not like failures, but like the working out of a sacred pattern, and it traced all the way back to a black-skinned king who had simply been the strongest of his age and had died fighting false gods from the sky. That is the legacy of Adus. A brief, brilliant unification that proved the Sith could be one people under one ruler. A war that taught them the stars could be crossed and planted in them the ambition to do it, and a memory that hardened into a prophecy of perfect, glorious self-destruction that would haunt the species and the order that took its name for the next 10,000 years. The greatest king the Sith produced left them 3 gifts, and every one of them was a blade pointed at their own heart. Before we follow the Sith out of their long fractured age and into the moment everything changed, I want to ask one thing of you, because you have come a long way into this already, and the deepest part of the story is still ahead. If you are finding something worthwhile in this slow walk through the oldest history in the galaxy, the kindest thing you can do is leave a comment, even a single word, and let the algorithm know this kind of thing deserves to find more people. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you would think. That is the last I will ask until the very end. From here we leave the age of Adus behind and turn to the event that ended the Sith species as it had always been and began the Sith as the galaxy would come to fear them. The day the exiles arrived. For thousands of years after Adus, the Sith species ruled itself the way it always had when no single king held the crown, which is to say badly and bloodily and entirely on its own. The wider galaxy did not trouble them again. The infinite empire that had come once and been thrown back eventually fell to its own troubles far away, its slaves rising, its machines failing, its reach collapsing inward until it was gone. The Sith neither knew nor cared. They were sealed in their remote stretch of space, fighting their endless internal wars, refining their dark arts, building and burying their lords, a closed and self-contained darkness turning over and over on itself, with no one watching. Whole dynasties rose and fell in that long isolation and left nothing behind but tombs. The species aged, and out beyond the edge of everything they knew, a very different conflict was building toward the moment that would crack their world open. That conflict had nothing to do with the Sith species at all, which is one of the great ironies of this entire history. The thing that would transform the Sith forever began as a quarrel among people who had never heard of Korriban. In the heart of a galaxy the Sith did not know existed. The Jedi Order by this age had grown into the guardians of the light side across the Republic, a brotherhood devoted to the Force in its aspect of harmony and restraint. But within any large body of Force users, there are always some who look at the powers their masters forbid and feel, instead of fear, hunger. Among the Jedi of that distant age, there arose a faction that did exactly that. They began to study the forbidden side of the Force, the side of passion and domination, and the bending of life itself to the will of the user. They learned to twist living things, to craft horrors out of flesh through what would later be called Sith alchemy, though they did not yet have that name for it. They built armies of altered creatures. They embraced everything the Jedi had sworn off. And they came to believe that the light side masters were cowards squandering the true potential of the Force out of fear. They were not yet Sith. They were Dark Jedi, fallen from the Order, and they wanted to rule. The war that followed is remembered as the 100-Year Darkness, and it nearly tore the Jedi apart. For 100 years, the Fallen Ones and their alchemical armies fought the Jedi who remained loyal to the light. and it was a savage, grinding conflict that ranged across many worlds and cost lives beyond counting. The Dark Jedi were powerful and inventive and utterly without restraint, and the things they made to fight for them were the stuff of nightmares. But the loyal Jedi had numbers and unity and the deep reserves of the Republic behind them, and in the end those told. The decisive blow came at a world called Korbus, where the loyal Jedi finally cornered and broke the Dark faction in a battle that ended the war. The Dark Jedi were defeated, and then the victors faced the question that always follows a civil war among those who can level cities with their minds. What do you do with the survivors? The Jedi did not execute them, whether out of mercy or out of a reluctance to become the very thing they had just defeated. The loyal order chose exile instead. The surviving Dark Jedi were stripped of their standing, herded onto ships, and cast out of the Republic entirely, banished into the unknown reaches with orders never to return. It was meant to be a kind of death, a sentence to wander and dwindle and die far from anything they had known. The Jedi expected the exiles to vanish into the dark and be forgotten. Instead, the exiles found a home, and in finding it, they became the most dangerous thing the galaxy would ever produce. Their long banishment carried them outward, deeper and deeper into uncharted space, away from everything the Republic knew, until at last they came to that remote southern stretch where two worlds turned in the dark, one burning and one frozen, both soaked in a power the exiles knew intimately and hungered for. They came to Korriban, and there they found a people. The fusion went deeper than names and rule. It went into the blood. The exiles did not remain a separate ruling caste of foreigners sitting atop the Sith species forever. They mixed with it. They took mates among the people they ruled, fathered and bore children that carried both lineages, the studied power of the fallen Jedi and the raw dark side birthright of the Sith species, blended into a single new bloodline. Over generations, the two became one. The pure exiles died off as individuals and lived on in their descendants, and the pure Sith species began, slowly and at first imperceptibly, to thin as more and more of the powerful were born of the mixed line rather than the old one. The Sith Lords of the ages that followed were increasingly hybrids, beings who looked Sith, who carried the red skin and the golden eyes and often the facial tendrils and the brow ridges, but whose power came as much from the inherited arts of the exiles as from the planet's gift. The species was not destroyed in that mixing. It was absorbed. It was diluted into the thing it had created, and that quiet dilution, beginning the day the exiles took mates among their worshippers, was the true beginning of the end for the Sith species as it had always been, even though it would take thousands of years to finish. Among the first of these exile lords, the Sith remembered names that would hang over Korriban forever. Ajunta Pal stood among the foremost of the fallen, who came down out of banishment to rule, and his tomb in the Valley of the Dead became one of the oldest and most feared of all. His name spoken with awe by Sith who came 10,000 years after him. He and the other founding lords laid the pattern that every Sith Lord afterward would follow. They ruled the species. They refined its dark arts by marrying the exiles' knowledge to the Sith bloodline's power, and they began building out of the old fractured Sith worlds something that for the first time in the species' history could genuinely call itself an empire, ordered, expanding, and ruled from the throne of Ziost by a line of lords who wore a stolen name. What grew out of that fusion was the first true Sith Empire, and it was unlike anything the Sith species had built on its own. The old Sith had been powerful but inward, sealed in their region, fighting themselves, reaching nowhere. The new Sith, with the exiles' knowledge of starflight grafted onto the species' raw strength, could finally do what the war against the infinite empire had hinted was possible. They could reach out. They could conquer beyond their homeworlds. They could build a dominion across many systems, bound together by the dark side and ruled by the Lords of the Sith. And they did exactly that, expanding across the Southern Dark into a hidden empire that the Republic, busy with its own affairs on the other side of the galaxy, did not even know existed. For age after age, the Sith Empire grew in secret, refining its power, raising its lords, burying its dead in the cliffs of Korriban, ruling from the cold throne of Ziost, a whole civilization of dark side users hidden behind the curtain of unknown space, waiting, though it did not know it was waiting, for the day the rest of the galaxy would finally stumble onto it. That empire would reach its height under a line of Dark Lords whose names the galaxy would eventually learn to fear, and the greatest of them would rule at the very moment the curtain was about to be torn down. To understand how the hidden empire of the Sith finally collided with the wider galaxy, and how that collision began the long catastrophe that would shatter the species for good, we have to meet the Dark Lord who sat the throne at the Empire's peak, and the ambitious sorcerer who could not wait for him to die. The Dark Lord who held the Sith Empire at its height was named Marka Ragnos, and he ruled the way the very strongest Sith always ruled, which is to say that he ruled by being so plainly dangerous that no one dared move against him. He came up the way Sith Lords always came up, through the murder of those above him, taking the title of Dark Lord of the Sith by killing the Lord who held it before him. And then he did the thing that very few Sith ever managed. He held it. For a span of about a century, Marka Ragnos sat the throne of the Sith and was not overthrown, which in a culture that treats the assassination of one's superior as a sacred duty is an achievement bordering on the miraculous. He was a hybrid in the full sense, carrying the blended blood of the old species and the exiles, embodying in his own person the fusion that had made the Empire, and he was strong enough in the dark side to keep the whole murderous machinery of Sith ambition pointed away from his own back for 100 years. Under Ragnos, the Empire was stable, powerful, and contentment is the one thing a Sith Empire cannot survive for long. While Ragnos lived, the ambitions of the lords beneath him had nowhere to go. The expansion had slowed. The Empire sat in its hidden corner of space, immense and dark, and turned inward once more. Its energies banked because the one being everyone feared would not die. But Sith ambition does not vanish when it is denied. It pools. It builds pressure behind the dam of a strong lord's life. And when that life finally ends, the flood comes all at once. Marka Ragnos was old, and powerful lords across the Empire were watching him age, and each of them was calculating what he would do the moment the old Dark Lord finally fell. Two of them were calculating harder than the rest. The first was Naga Sadow, a Sith Lord of enormous power and even more enormous ambition, a master of the old alchemical arts who looked at the Empire's long stagnation and saw not safety but waste. Sadow believed the Sith were meant to conquer, that an empire sitting still in the dark was an empire dying slowly, and that the moment Ragnos died, the Sith should burst out of their hidden region and fall upon the wider galaxy at last. He was reckless in the way that brilliant and impatient people are reckless, certain that boldness would carry the day where caution had only stagnated. The second was Ludo Kresh, and Kresh was Sadow's opposite in everything but ambition. Where Sadow burned to expand, Kresh believed expansion was suicide. He looked at the hidden empire and understood the thing that had kept it alive, which was that no one knew it was there. The galaxy was vast and old and full of powers that could crush the Sith if they were provoked, and as long as the Sith stayed hidden, refining their strength in secret, they were safe and they were free to grow in their own time. To Kresh, Sadow's dream of conquest was the dream of a fool who would lead the entire species to ruin by waking an enemy too large to fight. The two lords hated each other with the particular hatred of people who agree on the goal and despise each other's path to it. And as Marka Ragnos finally aged toward death, that hatred sharpened into the open. Ragnos died, and the dam broke. The struggle over the succession turned the funeral of the old Dark Lord into a battleground, the two great rival lords and their factions clashing over the empty throne. Sadow's vision of conquest against Kresh's vision of patient hiding, neither willing to yield. The whole empire pulled toward a civil war over which direction its future should take. And it was into exactly that moment of fracture, with the Sith leadership at each other's throats over whether to stay hidden or burst into the open, that the galaxy chose to arrive. It arrived in the form of two people who had no idea what they were doing. A brother and sister, Republic citizens, hyperspace explorers and traders, pushing into unknown space looking for new routes and new fortune, blundered through the dark and came out, by sheer terrible luck, inside the hidden Sith Empire. They were Gav and Jori Daragon, and they were nobody, two desperate young people fleeing debts and looking for a route that would make them rich. What they found instead was a civilization of dark side sorcerers that had been hiding from the galaxy for thousands of years, and their arrival was the single most consequential accident in the entire history of the Sith species. For the first time, the curtain had a hole in it. For the first time, someone from the Republic knew the way in, which meant the Sith now had a way out, and it meant the Republic could find its way to them. Ludo Kresh saw the Daragons for the disaster they were, and argued for the only sane response, which was to kill them quietly, erase any trace of their route, and slam the curtain shut again before anyone else could follow it. Naga Sado saw exactly the opposite. He saw a gift. Here were living charts, a path between the hidden empire and the soft, fat, unsuspecting Republic, delivered into Sith hands at the precise moment Sado was looking for a way to launch the conquest he had always dreamed of. He did not want to kill the Daragons. He wanted to use them. And in the chaos of the succession struggle, Sado seized the throne, took the title of Dark Lord, and turned the whole strength of the Sith Empire outward at last, toward the Republic, in the war that would be remembered as the Great Hyperspace War. It was everything Naga Sado had dreamed of, and everything Ludo Kresh had feared. The Sith poured out of their hidden region in a vast war fleet, falling upon Republic worlds that had never imagined such an enemy existed, and the first blows landed with devastating force. Sado was a master of illusion as much as of war, and he used the dark side to magnify his forces in the minds of his enemies, to make the Sith host seem even larger and more unstoppable than it was. And for a time it worked. The Republic reeled, worlds burned. The hidden empire of the Sith stood, briefly, on the edge of the conquest its lords had always believed was their destiny. But Kresh had been right about the size of the thing the Sith had woken. The Republic was vast beyond the Sith's understanding, and behind it stood the Jedi, the very order whose exiles had founded the Sith Empire in the first place, now turning the full weight of the light side against the dark children of their own banished traitors. The illusions faded. The Republic and the Jedi rallied, and the war that Sado had launched with such confidence turned, as so many Sith ventures turned, into a catastrophe. The Sith fleets were broken, the conquest collapsed, and the Republic, having found the route the Daragons had opened, did not merely repel the invasion, it followed the Sith home. That was the true disaster, the one that mattered for the species. For thousands of years the Sith had been safe because no one knew where they were. Now the enemy knew, and the enemy came, and the enemy was furious. Republic and Jedi forces pushed back along the path into the hidden region and fell upon the Sith worlds themselves, and the devastation they wrought was on a scale the Sith had never suffered. The homeworlds burned. The cities of black stone were broken. The population that had been bred and concentrated across thousands of years into the most powerful dark side bloodline in the galaxy was scattered, slaughtered, and shattered. Ludo Kresh, who had argued against the whole mad venture, died in the war, in some accounts at the hands of Sado's own treachery, the two great rivals destroying each other and their empire together in the end. And Naga Sado, the Dark Lord whose ambition had brought the storm down on his own people, fled. He did not flee empty-handed. Sado gathered the surviving Massassi, the bred warriors of the old species, and carried them away from the dying empire to a remote jungle moon called Yavin 4, far from the ruin he had made. There, in his long exile, he did to the Massassi what only a Sith would think to do. He used his alchemical arts to twist them further, reshaping the already engineered warriors into brutish, savage things, monstrous parodies of the proud caste they had been, and set them to building great temples in his name and to serving him as a god-king of a tiny stolen kingdom in the wilderness. The Massassi of Yavin 4, the degraded remnant of one of the oldest castes of the Sith species, would survive on that moon for thousands of years, worshipping a dead lord until their own slow end. It is one of the saddest footnotes in the whole history, a fragment of the ancient species ending its days as twisted slaves in a jungle, building monuments to the very lord whose ambition had destroyed their world. The great hyperspace war was over, and the first Sith Empire was finished. The throne of Ziost stood broken. The valley of Korriban held its dead in a world the Republic now knew and could reach. The hidden civilization that had grown in secret for thousands of years, the empire built from the fusion of the exiles and the species, the empire of Marka Ragnos at its proud height, was gone in the span of a few years of war, undone by a succession struggle, a pair of lost traders, and a Dark Lord who could not bear to keep waiting. And the species that had given the whole thing its name lay scattered and broken across its ruined worlds, its great bloodline shattered, its golden age and its empire alike, now nothing but memory and tombs. From here, the story of the Sith species stops being the story of a rising power and becomes the story of a long fading, the slow disappearance of a people into the order and the legend they had created. That fading and the strange afterlife of the bloodline is the last road we have to walk. An empire can fall in a few years. The things it built into the bones of its worlds take far longer to die, and some of them never do. When the Republic broke the Sith and went home, it left the homeworlds ruined but not empty, because the Sith had spent thousands of years filling Korriban in particular with things that do not simply stop existing when the kingdom that made them is gone. The Valley of the Tombs was still there. What slept in the tombs was still there, and the arts that the species had perfected across its long isolation, the dark sciences that were the true inheritance of the Sith, did not vanish with the throne of Ziost. They waited, the way everything on Korriban waits, for someone to come and wake them. To understand what the Sith left behind, you have to understand what the Sith actually did with their power, because conquest and war were only the crude surface of it. The deep work of the species, the thing the priest caste guarded and the lords pursued across lifetimes, was the bending of the Force and of life itself into instruments of the dark side. They called the broadest of these arts by names that later ages would gather under the labels of Sith sorcery and Sith alchemy, and there was nothing else quite like them anywhere in the galaxy. Sith sorcery was the art of the will made into a weapon, the dark side shaped by knowledge and ritual into effects that went far beyond the crude push and pull most Force users knew. A Sith sorcerer could throw lightning, yes, but that was the least of it. They could weave illusions so total that armies broke against enemies that were not there. as Naga Sado had done in the Great Hyperspace War, multiplying his fleets in the terrified minds of his foes. They could reach into a living body and stop it, drain the life from it, or bend the mind behind it to their service. The most patient and most feared of them pursued the art that obsessed Sith Lords above all others, the cheating of death itself. Through rituals of essence transfer, a dying Lord could tear his own spirit free of his failing body and force it into another, into a younger host, or into an object, a talisman, a holocron, anything that could hold a will strong enough to refuse the grave. Not all of them managed it cleanly. Many who tried this art did not survive into a new life, but lingered instead as something between living and dead. Bound spirits trapped in their own tombs, conscious and hungry, and unable to leave. The Valley of Korriban is full of them. The reason that world is so dangerous is not only the dark side soaked into the rock, it is that the rock holds the trapped spirits of beings who were powerful enough in life to refuse death, and not quite powerful enough to escape their own tombs. And those spirits have had thousands of years alone in the dark to grow patient and cruel and very, very hungry for a living body to wear. Sith alchemy was the other great art, and where sorcery worked on spirit and will, alchemy worked on flesh and matter. This was the science the fallen Jedi had brought with them, and the species had married to its own dark birthright, the art of reshaping living things into whatever the Maker desired. With it, the Sith took ordinary metal and forged the Sith sword, a blade worked through with dark side energy until it could turn aside a lightsaber and feed on the strength of anyone who dared wield it without the right. With it, they took beasts and twisted them into monsters, breeding and altering creatures into war things and guardians. The most famous of these guardians still walk Korriban today. The Sith bred a creature called the Toccata, the Sith Hound, a savage armored beast attuned to the dark side and set to guard the tombs of the Lords. And when the Empire fell, the Toccata did not stop. They went feral, they bred, and for thousands of years after there was anyone left to command them, packs of Sith hounds roamed the Valley of the Dead, killing whatever crossed their ground, still guarding tombs whose masters had been dust for an age. A people that builds its own extinction into a prophecy will also, it turns out, build guardians patient enough to outlast the extinction and keep killing in the name of lords no one remembers. And the species wrote everything down in its way. The Sith had their own language, an old harsh tongue suited to command and curse, and they carved it into their temples and their tombs and bound it into their highest works of knowledge. The greatest of those works were the holocrons, dense crystalline devices, often pyramidal, into which a Sith master could pour not just information, but something close to a fragment of himself, a gatekeeper, an interactive echo of the master's mind and will that could teach, guard, and judge those who came seeking the knowledge inside. A Sith holocron was a teacher that outlived its maker by thousands of years, and many of the most dangerous secrets of the species survived precisely because they had been sealed into these devices and hidden in the tombs of Korriban and the vaults of other Sith worlds, waiting for hands worthy or foolish enough to open them. And hands always came. This is the part of the story that turns the tomb world from a graveyard into something closer to a predator, because the death of the Sith species did not end its influence on the galaxy. In a strange and terrible way, it freed that influence to spread. A living empire is confined to its borders and its armies. A dead one, if it has buried enough power and enough hungry spirits in the right places, can reach anywhere, anytime, through anyone foolish enough to come looking. And across the long ages after the First Empire fell, they came looking constantly. They came because power is the one bait that never stops working. There were always ambitious beings in the galaxy, Force users who chafed at the restraint their orders demanded of them, seekers who heard the old rumors of a dead world where forbidden knowledge lay waiting, Darksiders who wanted what the Sith had wanted and believed they could take it cleanly where the Sith had failed. Korriban drew them the way deep water draws the reckless, and the planet and the things the species had left in it were patient and skilled at giving the Seekers exactly enough of what they wanted to destroy them with it. A visitor would enter a tomb seeking the knowledge of a long-dead Lord, and the Lord's bound spirit, 10,000 years alone in the dark and starving for contact, would wake and speak and teach, and the teaching would always come with a hook in it. Sometimes the spirit guided the seeker toward genuine power, the better to make use of him. Sometimes it simply took him, pouring its ancient will into the living body that had so conveniently walked into reach, wearing the visitor like a stolen coat and walking out of the tomb into a galaxy the dead Lord had been locked away from since before the visitor's species existed. The trapped kings of Korriban could not leave their tombs on their own, but a living body that came to them was a door, and they had 10,000 years to perfect the art of walking through it. There is something almost admirable in it, if you can stomach admiring a thing so cruel, and the Sith themselves certainly would have admired it. A people that could keep fighting, keep spreading, keep claiming new servants for 10,000 years after its own extinction, simply through the sheer accumulated weight of the power it had buried and the spirits it had refused to let die, is a people that took its own central principle to a conclusion no other culture in the galaxy ever reached. The strong consume the weak and grow stronger. The Sith had consumed so much and buried so much of what they consumed that even death could not stop them from reaching out to consume more. They had made themselves, in the most literal sense, undying, not as individuals living forever, but as a hunger that outlived its own body and went on feeding through whatever mouths it could borrow. The Valley of Korriban was the heart of that hunger, the wellspring it all flowed from, and every age that sent its ambitious children to that dead world to seek forbidden power was an age that fed the dead species a fresh meal and called the indigestion a new war. This is why the renaming of the world mattered so much, and why the forgetting was so dangerous. As the ages wore on and the world lost even its name, becoming a half-legend that the wise dismissed as myth, the galaxy lost its memory of what the place actually was. It stopped guarding the valley because it stopped believing the valley was real, and an unguarded wellspring of buried dark side power, full of trapped and hungry spirits and seeded with artifacts that spread corruption like a plague, left open and forgotten at the edge of the galaxy, is one of the most dangerous things that can exist, precisely because no one is watching it anymore. The Sith species did its deadliest work not when it was a feared empire, but when it was a forgotten grave, because a feared empire can be fought and a forgotten grave just sits there, patient, waiting for the next curious seeker to wander in and become the next body the dead can wear. The species had turned its own extinction into a weapon and its own homeworld into a trap, and the galaxy's forgetting into the trap's best disguise. So picture the valley after the Empire's fall, because this is the image the whole story keeps returning to. The cities broken, the throne shattered, the great living civilization gone, but the cliffs still lined with sealed tombs, the tombs still holding the bodies and, in too many cases, the trapped and waiting spirits of lords who had refused to die. The dark side still pressing on the world thicker than ever, fed now by a fresh war's worth of death. Feral Sith hounds still patrolling the dust, holocrons full of forbidden knowledge still sealed in the dark, inscriptions in a dead tongue still covering the temple walls. The Sith species was broken, but Korriban had become a kind of trap baited with everything the dark side could promise. And across the ages that followed, it would draw the ambitious and the desperate to it again and again, would teach them, would use them, and very often would kill them. The tomb world did not need a living empire to be dangerous. It had become its own slow engine, and it ran on the dead. Among those dead were names that the Sith of every later age spoke with awe. Ajunta Pal, one of the first of the exiled lords to take the rule of the species, lay in one of the oldest tombs, his spirit lingering there for thousands of years, bitter and trapped, until a wanderer would one day come who could finally release him. Tulak Hord, a Dark Lord of an age before the Great Hyperspace War, was remembered as perhaps the deadliest duelist and one of the mightiest sorcerers the Sith ever produced. His tomb a place of particular dread. Marka Ragnos, the lord who had held the throne for a century at the Empire's height, was entombed with all the weight his long reign had earned, and his spirit, too, was said to wake and speak to those who entered, judging them, mocking them, sometimes guiding the worthy toward power and always toward ruin. These were not merely graves. They were the resting places of beings who had been gods to their people, and the dark side had let too many of them stay in one form or another long after their bodies failed. This is the true monument of the Sith species more than any empire, not the conquests which failed, not the throne which broke, the arts, the tombs, the trapped and waiting dead. The knowledge sealed in crystal and the guardians bred to protect it, and the world soaked so deep in the dark side that it became a wellspring the ambitious would return to for 10,000 years. The species poured itself into these things across its whole existence, and these things outlasted the species by an age. Long after the last pure-blooded Sith was gone, the work of the Sith remained, doing in death exactly what it had done in life, drawing power to the strong and death to the weak, and asking nothing of the world but more bodies to feed on. That was the bargain the species had made with its own planet at the very beginning. Strength now in exchange for everything later, and the tombs of Korriban are what the bargain looks like when the bill comes due, and there is no one left alive to pay it but ghosts. But the bloodline itself was not quite finished, even after the Empire fell. Scattered, shattered, thinned by the long fusion with the exiles, and now by a war that had butchered its homeworlds, the Sith species survived in fragments, in remnants, in the mixed descendants who carried its blood out into the dark. And one of those fragments would do something extraordinary. It would gather itself in secret, far from the eyes of the Republic that thought it had won, and it would build, slowly and patiently across thousands of years, a second empire that would one day return to shake the galaxy to its foundations. The afterlife of the Sith bloodline is the last thing we have to follow, and it carries us all the way to the edge of the species' final disappearance. When the Republic shattered the first Sith Empire, it believed it had ended the threat for good. It had not. It had only scattered the seeds. In the chaos of the Empire's collapse, while the homeworlds burned and the great lords killed each other over a throne that no longer meant anything, a remnant of the Sith slipped away into the dark. They did not flee to a jungle moon to dwindle, as Naga Sado had. They fled in the opposite direction, deeper into the unknown regions of the galaxy, away from the Republic and the Jedi and any chart that anyone in the wider galaxy possessed. And there, in territory no enemy could find, they began to rebuild. It would take them more than 1,000 years. They had the patience for it. The Sith always did, when staying hidden was the price of survival. And the lesson of the Great Hyperspace War had been carved into the survivors in letters of fire. Never again would they let the galaxy see them coming. The being who rose to lead that hidden rebuilding was, in his origins, a child of the pure Sith species, and his story is the high water mark of everything the bloodline had been reaching toward since the beginning. He was born with a strength in the dark side that frightened even the Sith, and his hunger pointed at the one prize the species had chased across its whole history, the conquest of death. Where lesser lords had managed only to trap their fading spirits in tombs, he reached for something total. He gathered the dark side on a scale no single Sith had ever attempted and turned it on an entire world, consuming the life of every living thing on the planet in one vast ritual, draining a whole biosphere into himself to purchase what the Sith had always wanted and never truly held. He emerged from that atrocity immortal in the way the Sith had only dreamed of being, a being who would not age and could not be permanently killed by any ordinary means. His spirit anchored so firmly in the dark side that death could not keep its grip on him. He took the survivors of the fled empire and made himself their emperor, and he ruled them not for a century, as Marka Ragnos had, but for over 1,000 years, the same immortal will at the head of the same growing power, generation after generation, while the galaxy that thought the Sith were finished went about its business in ignorance. The reconstituted empire eventually did what Sith empires always do. It revealed itself. It warred against the Republic in a great galactic conflict that raged across the stars, and though it came far closer to victory than the first empire ever had, it too was eventually fought to a standstill and then to decline. The immortal emperor's grip slipped. The empire fractured, recovered, fractured again, ground down across centuries of war against the Republic and the Jedi, and in the end, against its own endless internal treachery, the same Sith curse that had torn the species apart in the deepest past, still doing its patient work thousands of years later. And as that empire declined across the long ages, so did the bloodline at its heart. The pure bloods fought and died in wars that consumed lords faster than the dwindling line could replace them. They mixed further with the humans who surrounded them. Their numbers thinned and thinned and thinned until the proud aristocracy of the ancient species became first uncommon, then rare, then a scattering of individuals, then a memory. By the time the long wars of the Old Republic gave way to the ages that followed, the pure Sith species was vanishing from the galaxy. In fact, even as the name Sith blazed brighter than ever in legend, new Sith orders rose and fell. New Dark Lords claimed the title and waged new wars. The Sith as a power went through cycle after cycle of resurgence and near destruction across the millennia. But these later Sith were, increasingly, not Sith at all in the old sense of the word. They were humans. They were near humans. They were Force users of 100 species who had taken up the dark side tradition and the title that came with it, while the actual red-skinned people who had first owned that name dwindled toward nothing in the background. Unnoticed, their blood scattered so thin through so many lineages that it could no longer gather itself into a people. The order the species had created had finally completely eaten the species that created it. The conquerors had not just taken the name. Across 10,000 years, they had taken everything the name was attached to, until only the name was left. There is a bitter symmetry in it that the Sith themselves would have appreciated in their cold way. The species had built its entire civilization on the principle that the strong consume the weak and grow stronger by it. In the end, the species was consumed by the very thing it had made strong. The exiles came as worshippers and became masters. The order grew on the species' blood and then outgrew its need for that blood. The strong fed on the strong until the original strength was used up entirely, and what remained was the appetite without the body, the title without the people, the dark side still hungry and still spreading under a name whose first owners were dust in the tombs of a world the galaxy had nearly forgotten. The Sith species had written its own ending into its first principle and into its oldest prophecy, and the ending arrived exactly as promised, glorious and total ruin wearing the mask of triumph. Which brings us, at the very end, back to the valley where we began, and to the question of what is actually buried there, and what it means that the most feared word in the galaxy started its life as the name of a people now gone. What is buried in the valley of Korriban is, in the end, a religion. Not only bodies, and not only the trapped and waiting spirits, but the whole faith that the Sith species built around itself across the longest span of its history. The set of beliefs that made the cruelty feel like worship and the conquest feel like prayer. To understand what those tombs mean, you have to understand what the people in them believed. And the heart of that belief was simple enough to state and terrible enough to live by. The Sith worshipped power, and they worshipped the dark side as the truest expression of it. And they held that the strong were meant by the very nature of things to rule the weak, and that any other arrangement was a sickness to be cured. This was not a faith of comfort. Most religions across the galaxy offer their followers something. A promise of justice, a hope of peace, a reason to endure suffering. The Sith faith offered none of that. It offered the truth as the Sith saw it, which was that the universe was a furnace of competing wills, and that the only meaning available to anyone was to burn hotter and longer than everything around them. Mercy in this faith was not a virtue with a downside. It was a disease, a failure of the will, a thing that infected the strong and dragged them down to the level of the weak who deserved their fate. Compassion was the enemy. Restraint was cowardice dressed up as wisdom. Peace was a lie told by the frightened to keep the strong from taking what was theirs. The Sith did not arrive at these conclusions reluctantly. They embraced them with the fervor of true believers because their whole world, the dark side pressure of their planet, the rewards the Force itself seemed to pour onto the dominant, confirmed the faith every single day. On Korriban, the strong really did grow stronger by feeding on the weak. The religion was, by the evidence of the Sith's own senses, simply true. Their cosmology was less a set of stories about creation than a hierarchy of power running from the bottom of existence to the top. At the bottom were the drones, the slaves, the weak, the things to be used. At the top were the God Kings, the sorcerer-lords, the beings so saturated with the dark side that they stood, in the eyes of their people, above the line that separated the mortal from the divine. The Sith did not draw a sharp boundary between a powerful lord and a god, because in their understanding the difference was only one of degree. A great enough sorcerer simply was a god, by virtue of being great enough, and the worship the lower castes offered their rulers was not metaphor. It was the recognition of a real divinity measured in raw power. This is why the dead kings could not be allowed to simply die and be gone. A god does not stop being a god because his body failed. The obsession with cheating death that runs through all of Sith history was not only personal ambition, though it was that. It was theological. A being who had become divine through power was supposed to be able to refuse the grave, and the rituals of essence transfer and spirit binding were the Sith reaching for the immortality their own faith told them the truly powerful had earned. The tombs of Korriban are full of beings who believed with total sincerity that they were too powerful to die, and who proved themselves at least partly right by lingering in those tombs for thousands of years as spirits that would not let go. Everything the galaxy knows about this faith, though, comes filtered through a lens, and the lens was held by the conquerors. Almost nothing survives from the hand of the pure Sith species, written in its own voice, on its own terms. What survives was recorded by the exiles and their descendants, the masters who took the name, and the foremost of those chroniclers was one of the original fallen Jedi herself. a sorceress among the exiles who set herself the task of studying and recording the people her kind had come to rule. She watched the Sith species closely. She catalogued their castes and their rites and their arts. She wrote down their beliefs and their history as she understood them. And in doing so, she became the single most important source for everything later ages would think they knew about the old Sith. And she was not a neutral observer. She was a conqueror studying the conquered. A fallen Jedi fascinated by a people she considered raw material for the dark side order she and her fellow exiles meant to build. Her records served her purposes. They flattered the things she wanted to take from the Sith and dismissed the things she did not value. When she helped shape the creed of the New Order, she took the brutal power worship of the species and refined it into something colder and more elegant, a philosophy fit for the sophisticated Darksiders the exiles intended to become. And that refined creed, with its talk of passion and strength and the breaking of chains, is what later Sith would recite as their highest principle, never quite remembering that it had been distilled from the faith of a people it had also helped to erase. The order that the species had founded spent the ages after the Old Republic doing the one thing it could never stop doing, which was destroying itself. The Sith would rise, build power, threaten the galaxy, and then turn on one another, lord against lord, apprentice against master, faction against faction, until the dark side they worshipped had consumed almost as many Sith as Jedi. Time and again, the Order clawed its way back to strength, only to shatter again on the same rock it always shattered on. The simple fact that a creed which teaches every Sith that the strong must overthrow the strong above them cannot hold any structure together for long. The Sith'ari prophecy had promised it from the beginning, a people and an order whose highest principle is the violent overthrow of the powerful by the more powerful, is a people forever eating its own future. The old species had torn itself apart this way in the deep past before Addus united it. The Order tore itself apart this way over and over across the millennia that followed, and the wreckage piled higher each time. The last and worst of those self-inflicted catastrophes came in a long series of wars that nearly ended the Sith and the Republic together. By the end of it, the Sith Order had gathered itself into a great brotherhood of dark side users, hundreds of them, massed for a final victory. And that victory turned instead into annihilation. In a single catastrophic event, the assembled Sith were almost entirely wiped out, destroyed not by the Jedi alone, but by the unleashed dark side itself, the power they worshipped finally turning on the worshippers en masse. When the smoke cleared, the order that had carried the name of the species for 10,000 years was reduced to almost nothing. Almost. One survived, who had seen exactly what had gone wrong, and who drew from the ruin a conclusion that would change the meaning of the word Sith forever. He was a human, with no drop of the old blood, born long after the species that first owned his title had faded from the galaxy. He looked at the smoking wreck of the Brotherhood and at 10,000 years of Sith history before it, and he saw the pattern with a clarity none of his predecessors had managed. The Sith destroyed themselves. Their numbers were their weakness. Every time the Order grew large, the infighting grew with it, the strong turning on the strong until the whole thing collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. His answer was as ruthless as anything in Sith history and, in its cold way, brilliant. There would no longer be a Sith Order in the old sense. No brotherhood, no empire, no caste of lords scheming against one another. There would be exactly two Sith at any time, one master to hold the power and embody the dark side, and one apprentice to crave it, to learn it, and eventually to take it by killing the master and taking an apprentice of their own. Two, no more. The ambition that had always destroyed the Sith would be channeled and pointed, master to apprentice, down the generations, instead of being allowed to spread and tear the Order apart. The Sith would survive by becoming a secret, a line of two passed hand to hand in the dark, while the galaxy believed them extinct. It worked. For the first time in the history of the name, the Sith stopped destroying themselves wholesale, because there was no longer a crowd to feed the infighting, only the single clean act of succession built into the design. The Sith vanished from galactic knowledge. The Jedi came to believe they had been wiped out entirely, a danger of the distant past, and across roughly 1,000 years the line of two passed quietly down through master after master and apprentice after apprentice, hidden, patient, accumulating knowledge and power and a single unwavering purpose: the eventual overthrow of the Republic and the Jedi and the return of the dark side to the rule of the galaxy. That long hidden line is the one the galaxy remembers best, because at its end stood the figures of the age everyone knows, the masked apprentice in black armor, the old man on the throne who would seize an empire by pretending to be a servant of the very republic he meant to destroy. They were Sith. They wore the name. They carried the creed the exiles had distilled and the ambition the species had bred into the dark side 10,000 years before. And they were, every one of them, in that final line, human beings who had no idea or no care that the word they bore had ever meant anything but power. By their age, the homeworld itself had become a half-forgotten legend. Korriban, the tomb world, the cradle of the species, the valley of the dead kings, had even lost its name. Later generations called it Moraband, and many doubted the place had ever been real at all, treating it as a story, a myth of an origin world that probably never existed, the kind of thing the credulous believed and the sophisticated dismissed. The Sith of the final age, the masters of the hidden line, knew better. The deepest among them still made the pilgrimage to that dead world, still walked the valley where the dust never settles, still knelt before the tombs of lords they could name, and drew power and knowledge from spirits 10,000 years old. But even they came as students of a foreign greatness, not as sons of the soil. They were heirs to the Order, not to the blood. The species that had built the tombs, that had bred the guardians that still prowled the dust, that had carved the dead language on the temple walls, was gone so completely that its own spiritual descendants thought of its homeworld as a place of pilgrimage and a source of forbidden power, rather than as the grave of their own ancestors. The strangers had moved into the house so long ago that they no longer remembered it had ever belonged to anyone else. There is one last thread to follow before we stand in the valley one final time, and it is the oldest thread of all. The Sith'ari, the prophecy of the perfect being who would destroy the Sith and remake them stronger. The idea that had crystallized around the memory of King Adus in the deepest past and haunted the species and the Order across every age since. That prophecy never died. It surfaced again and again whenever a lord rose powerful enough to make people wonder. And in the very design of the hidden line of two, some saw it finally coming true. The human master, who had reduced the Sith to two, had, after all, done exactly what the prophecy promised. He had destroyed the Sith as they were, the sprawling, self-devouring Order, and remade them into something that survived and ultimately triumphed where the old way had only ever collapsed. By that reading, the destroyer was the savior, the ruin was the rebirth, and the prophecy, a black-skinned king had given his people 10,000 years before, was fulfilled at last by a human who shared none of his blood, in service of a dark side that had long since forgotten the people who first gave it a name. The Sith'ari had promised glorious destruction. The species got the destruction. The Order, for a while, got the glory. And the prophecy, like everything else the species made, outlived its makers, and worked itself out on strangers. That is how the name traveled, from a people to their conquerors, to an empire, to an order, to a hidden line of two, to an old man on a throne who ruled a galaxy in the name of a word whose first owners were 10,000 years dead. The Sith species is the silence underneath all of it, the buried foundation, the grave the whole long history was built on top of. And so we come back, as the story always must, to the valley. Stand at the head of the valley now, in the age after the empires, after the order has dwindled to its hidden line of two, after the homeworld has lost even its name. The wind is the same wind. The dust still moves across the same red rock. The statues with their hollow eyes still watch the long approach, and the cliffs on either side are still pierced with the dark doorways of the tombs. Walk the valley slowly, because the dead here are worth knowing by name, and because the names are nearly all that is left of the founding age. The bodies are dust. The empire is gone. But the tombs remember who was laid in them, and so should we. The first dark shapes you might see moving in the distance are not Sith and never were. They are the Tukata, the Sith hounds, the bred guardians of the valley. Still here after 10,000 years, still patrolling the ground their long-dead masters set them to keep. They are armored, savage, attuned to the dark side, and entirely beyond reason, and they will kill anything that comes too close to the tombs they were made to protect. No one feeds them, no one commands them. They simply persist, generation after feral generation, an instinct bred so deep that it survived the extinction of everyone who could ever call it off. They are the perfect monument to the species in a way, a loyalty so total and so artificial that it kept running long after there was anyone left to be loyal to. Past the hounds, the tombs begin, and the oldest of them belong to the founders, the exiles who came down out of banishment and took the name. Among the very first lies the one the Sith remembered as the first true Dark Lord of their order, the exile who rose above his fellow castaways to rule the species they had all conquered together. In life, he was a leader among the fallen Jedi, ambitious and powerful, and in death his spirit lingered in his tomb for thousands of years, bitter and bound, neither escaping into a new life nor finding any rest, trapped by the very arts the Sith prized. He waited there across the whole rise and fall of everything his order built, a founder outliving his foundation as a ghost in a hole in a cliff, until at last, in a far later age, a single visitor would come who understood what he truly was and would help him do the one thing his pride had never let him do in life, which was to let go. His was the first of the great tombs. The pattern of all the others was set by it. Power, then death refused, then a long imprisonment in the dark, then either release or the endless waiting that most of them got instead. Not far from him lie the others of the founding company, and each of them left the galaxy something to remember them by, usually something terrible. One of the exiles was a sorcerer consumed by the desire to dominate other beings utterly, body and will, and he poured that desire into an artifact, a talisman worked through with dark side power, designed to seize control of those who came near it and bend them into a mindless, obedient horde, answering to whoever held the talisman itself. He died, as they all did. The talisman did not. It passed down through the ages as one of the most dangerous objects the Sith ever made, surfacing again and again across thousands of years to spread its plague of enslavement wherever some fool uncovered it, each time a fresh echo of a dead exile's hunger to own other people completely. That was his monument. Not a tomb so much as a curse with a long memory. Another of the founders was a healer, which is a strange thing to find among the Sith until you understand what healing meant to them. She was ancient even by the standards of the exiles, one of the oldest of the fallen, and her arts of preserving and restoring life were turned, like everything the Sith touched, toward power rather than mercy, to keep a useful servant alive, to extend one's own existence, to repair the damage that the dark side did to the bodies of those who wielded it too greedily. These were the uses of healing in a Sith hand. She lived a very long time, longer than almost any of her fellow exiles, and she watched the order they had founded take root and grow before she too passed into the cliffs of the valley. Her knowledge, like all the rest, was written down, copied, and inherited by strangers, and one of them wrote. She was the chronicler, the exiled sorceress who set herself to study the conquered species and record everything about it. And more than any blade or talisman, her work is the reason we can stand in this valley and name anything at all. She catalogued the castes. She studied the rites and the arts and the beliefs. She took the raw, brutal power worship of the Sith species and refined it into a colder and more elegant philosophy, a creed of passion and strength and the breaking of chains that later Sith would recite for 10,000 years as their highest truth. Her records became the foundation of everything the Order knew about its own origins, and through the Order they became the foundation of everything the wider galaxy would ever learn about the old Sith. She is the lens. She is the fog. Every time anyone has spoken with authority about what the Sith species was, they have been leaning, knowingly or not, on the writings of a conqueror who studied a doomed people the way a collector studies a specimen, and who shaped the record to serve the Order she was helping to build on the bones of that people. Her tomb is one among many in the valley. Her influence is the air the whole story is told in. Deeper into the valley lie lords from the ages after the founding, the great Dark Lords of the Empire's long middle years, and among them the species-buried beings whose power has rarely been matched in any era. One was remembered as the supreme master of the blade and a sorcerer of formidable depth, a Dark Lord whose skill in single combat became the standard against which later Sith measured themselves and almost always fell short. His tomb was a place of particular dread even among the Sith, a proving ground where the dark side ran so strong that those who entered seeking the Lord's lingering knowledge often did not come out, or came out changed. Another was a Sith king of the old homeworld in the age before the Great War with the Republic, a ruler who united Korriban under his own hand and who poured his will into one of the first holocrons the Sith ever made, sealing a fragment of himself into crystal so that he might teach and rule beyond death. He was killed in the end, as Sith kings tend to be, but the death did not take, not entirely. His spirit clung to the world and to the objects he had charged with his power, including a crowned helm worked through with his own preserved will, an artifact that could grant its wearer a measure of the dead king's strength and a large measure of his domination, at the usual Sith price of one's own self. And there, with all the weight his long reign had earned, lies the Lord who held the Empire at its height, the Dark Lord whose century on the throne was the closest the Sith ever came to stability, the one whose funeral broke into the succession struggle that drew the galaxy in and ended the First Empire. His tomb is among the grandest in the valley, and his spirit, like so many of the others, did not consent to silence. Across the ages that followed, those who entered his resting place reported the dead Lord waking to speak, to test them, to judge their worth and their power, sometimes guiding the strong toward greater darkness, and always, in the end, toward the ruin that the dark side promises everyone who serves it. He had been a god to his people in life. He remained, after a fashion, a god in the tomb, dispensing power and doom to the worthy and the foolish alike for 10,000 years. This is the valley, Tomb after tomb, lord after lord, a roll call of the most powerful dark side users the galaxy ever produced, almost all of them still present in some bound and waiting form, almost none of them at peace. The species built this place as the resting ground for its divinities, and the dark side it worshipped paid it back by refusing to let those divinities rest, holding them instead in a long, conscious twilight, neither living nor dead, hungry and patient in the dark. To walk the valley is to walk among gods who got exactly the immortality they prayed for and discovered too late what it cost. There is no greater illustration of the whole Sith bargain anywhere in the galaxy. Strength now in exchange for everything later. They got the strength. The valley is the everything later, and it is a graveyard that will not stop being a graveyard on a world that forgot its own name, guarded by hounds that forgot their own masters, full of kings who refused to forget themselves and were trapped forever in the refusing. The valley holds the lords, but it does not hold all of the species, and the fate of the rest is its own quiet tragedy. Remember the Massassi, the warrior caste, bred across thousands of years for strength and savagery and absolute devotion, the spear of the old Sith. When the first empire fell and Naga Sado fled the ruin of his own making, it was the Massassi he carried away with him to the distant jungle moon, and there he did to them the last cruelty their kind would suffer at Sith hands for a long time. He twisted them further with his alchemy, degrading the proud warriors into brutish, dwindling things, and set them to building temples and worshipping him as a god, while he sank into a long sleep, waiting for a worthy heir to wake him. The Massassi of that moon bred and labored and worshipped across thousands of years, a fragment of the ancient species ending its days as slaves in a wilderness, keeping the temples of a dead lord who had destroyed their world. Their end, when it finally came, was the most fitting and the most terrible echo of everything the species had ever been. Ages later, another Dark Lord came to that moon, drawn by the old power sleeping there, and he found the degraded Massassi still keeping their endless vigil. He did not free them. He used them the way the Sith had always used their warriors. He drained the life from the entire remaining Massassi people in a single great ritual, consuming all of them at once to bind his own spirit into the temples they had spent millennia building, purchasing his own immortality with the last lives of the oldest warrior caste in the galaxy. That was the final fate of the Massassi, bred to be used, degraded into slaves, and then spent down to the last soul to fund one more Dark Lord's flight from death. The warrior caste of the Sith species did not fade gently into history. It was consumed completely to feed the very appetite it had been created to serve, and with its consumption the last large body of the old blood anywhere in the galaxy was simply gone. The rest of the species dispersed the only way a shattered, diluted bloodline can. It thinned into the wider galaxy, generation by generation, drop by drop. The pure bloods of the reconstituted empire had been the last great gathering of the old blood, the last time the species held itself together as a recognizable people with pride in its lineage, and even they had been a proud minority, sitting atop an order that was mostly something else. After that empire ground itself down across its long centuries of war and treachery, the pure bloods scattered like everyone else, mixing further with the humans who had long since become the bulk of the Sith Order, until the unmixed blood grew so rare that carrying it was less a heritage than an accident. The old physiology surfaced now and then in later individuals, a flash of red skin, a trace of the old features, a strength in the dark side that ran a little too deep and a little too easily. But these were echoes, scattered notes of a song whose singers were gone. The species did not go extinct in a single moment. It dissolved slowly into the very order it had founded, until there was no longer a people to point to, only a faint old strain running thin through 1,000 unrelated lines, and a name that had long since stopped meaning anyone in particular. So now you know whose tombs those are. You know why the world was renamed for the dead. And you know what it really means that the most feared word in galactic history was, at the start, simply what a living people called themselves. The Sith were not always a hood and a red blade. They were not always an old man on a throne or a masked figure breathing in the dark. Before any of that, for longer than any of that, the Sith were a species, red-skinned, golden-eyed, born on a world soaked in death, sensitive to the dark side in their very blood, organized into castes built to harvest power, ruled by sorcerer-kings, haunted from their earliest days by a prophecy that promised them glory and ruin in the same breath. They built an empire in secret and lost it in a single mad war. They gave their name and their world and their blood and their faith to the conquerors who came down out of exile pretending to be gods. And those conquerors carried the stolen name across 10,000 years and 100 worlds, until the people it first belonged to had dissolved into the legend they had created and been forgotten by their own spiritual heirs. The Order ate the species. The name outlived the people, and the dark side they worshipped kept its oldest promise to them in full, giving them strength beyond measure and taking in exchange everything and everyone they ever were. There is a lesson buried in the valley, but it is not the kind of lesson the Sith would have wanted carved on their tombs. It is not that power is hollow or that cruelty fails, because by their own measure, the Sith did not fail. They got what they reached for. They became gods to their people. They built immortality with the lives of others. They made a name so terrible, the galaxy still flinches at it 10,000 years later. The lesson is quieter and sadder than that. It is that a people who build their whole existence around consuming the weak will, given enough time, run out of weak to consume and start on each other, and then on themselves, and the appetite they worshipped will outlive every single one of them and go looking for the next host. The Sith species made the dark side a religion, and the dark side accepted the worship, and then it outlasted the worshippers and went on without them, wearing their name like a mask over a face that no longer belonged to anyone. That is what is buried in the valley of Korriban. Not a villain, a people. The first ones. The ones who were a name before they were a nightmare, and who became the foundation that the nightmare was built on top of, and who lie there still under the moving dust, while the statues with the hollow eyes keep watching the empty valley for kings who are never coming back. The wind moves through the valley the way it always has. The doors of the tombs stay shut. Somewhere in the dark behind them, the old lords wait in their long twilight, neither living nor dead, and the hounds still pace the dust, and the dead language still covers the walls in letters that fewer and fewer beings in the galaxy can read. The Sith species is gone, but Korriban remembers. Korriban always remembers. And as long as anyone is willing to walk the valley and learn the names and tell the story, the people who first owned the most feared word in the galaxy will not be entirely lost, even now, even here, at the end of everything they were. Thank you for staying with me through all of it, through the deep past and the empires and the long fading, all the way down into the valley. If this slow walk through the oldest history in the galaxy is the kind of thing that quiets your mind and helps you rest, the best thing you can do is subscribe and keep the notifications on so the next of these journeys finds you when it is ready. And consider leaving a comment with whichever of these ancient lords you would most like to hear the full story of next, because there are many more tombs in this valley and many more names worth telling. Until then, rest easy. The statues will keep watching the dust, and the story will be here whenever you want to walk it again.